We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to the latest Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by John Ferguson, who's the editor of the Sunday Mail, and of course Ben Borland, the editor of the Scottish Daily Express. So it's been a very quiet week. Nothing much has happened. On Monday we had the resignation of the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. Tuesday, Peter Murrell was jailed for over 5 years after admitting to a 12-year crime spree with SNP funds. Let's start with Starmer first. John, he bowed to the inevitable. I think everyone saw that he was going to resign, given the pressure he was under with Andy Burnham winning that by-election. We'll talk about Burnham a bit later, but Keir Starmer was Prime Minister for nearly 2 years. Do you think he's got a legacy?
I think he has one. I'm not sure if it's the best one. You know, in terms of delivery, I think he kind of did what he said he was going to do, which was to try to do the hard work of sorting out public finances and reforming some parts of government spending. I think the problem was that he just didn't have the personality to take the public or even his party with him on that journey. Whether or not replacing him turns out to be a good move, it really is the $6 million question now. If you ask the Tory party then how it went for them when they changed from Boris Johnson through to Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, that they found to their cost that actually just changing the face at the top doesn't tend to work. So interestingly enough, it felt to me like Starmer was probably more popular than he'd ever been in those last weeks when his back was really to the wall, and he seemed to be a guy who was saying, I'm going to fight to the last, and he kind of felt like we always saw his real personality for the first time since he became Prime Minister. That resignation speech, I think, was the first time you saw genuine emotion, and perhaps if he'd managed to muster some of those things over the last 2 years, he would still be in his job.
But I feel like he was a very successful Labour leader, but a very unsuccessful Prime Minister. So if you look at it in party terms, he takes over in 2020. Labour is a pile of rubble. He inherited the party from Jeremy Corbyn. It's infected with anti-Semitism. They're viewed as being weak on the economy, defence, all these key issues for voters. Folk were talking about there never being a Labour government ever again, and he painstakingly reformed the Labour Party. I know that the Tories were weak by the time of the general election in 2024, but it was still a monumental achievement to overturn that Boris majority in one term. Then, of course, he gets in, doesn't seem to have much of a plan, and in terms of a legacy, it's hard. I mean, most of the credit he got was for what he did on the international stage. He always seemed to look like the adult in the room, but in terms of a domestic agenda, there's no Starmerism in the same way there was Thatcherism or Blairism. And I think he'll look back on his 2 years in Downing Street with an enormous sense of regret.
I think he'll be very, very disappointed. I think that was evident from the speech where he was clearly quite emotional. I think he'll be hugely disappointed. I think he'll be quite a forgettable Prime Minister, in future decades when the history of the UK is written. I don't think he had it. I think it's almost an example of what not to do, which is come in and, make all these unpopular decisions, and lo and behold, you become incredibly unpopular. I mean, it just never seemed like a natural politician, and I don't think he was. He was a lawyer. He's an international lawyer. He was the director of public prosecutions down in England. He's very much a sort of man of the machine rather than a man of the people. And I think his time in office will be forgotten, apart from how not to be a Prime Minister.
He him and his team put so much effort into winning the election, getting rid of the Tories. They seemed to overlook a plan for what they were going to do when they had that power. I mean, the first 100 days of any government is so important, yet their first 100 days was a complete catastrophe. I mean, the first thing they did was that winter fuel payment. I mean, at a time when voters were wanting to be given more money, they were actually taking money away from people. And I think Starmer fell into that trap that, well, I've got political capital, I need to be tough and be seen to make tough decisions. Whereas voters really want to draw a line under the previous 14 years of tough choices under the Tories. They wanted something a bit more positive and upbeat, and he just simply wasn't able to deliver that.
Yeah, you almost get the feeling that he believed himself the idea that the Tories were just so bad and chaotic that all it needed was him to come in as a sort of sensible, pragmatic guy, and that would kind of turn the country around. I think the winter fuel payment debacle is the classic example of why Keir Starmer just didn't work. Now, the policy in itself to get rid of it, there is a strong argument to be made that this is a ridiculous benefit, that it's a unmeans-tested handout to one of the richest sections of society and pensioners, which was devised by the Tories basically to buy their votes. So there was a strong argument to be made that actually this was a tough decision that was in the interests of the country and was the fair decision to make. But instead of doing that, Keir Starmer kind of almost apologised for withdrawing it and made the argument was,
So,
well,
well, we've been forced to do it
I
'cause
would like you to have the winter fuel payment, but circumstances mean we can't afford it. And so he ended up apologising for something that he should have actually been making the positive case for doing. And I mean, he came into the job basically aware of the fact he was going to need to make tough decisions. If you're going to need to make tough decisions, you've also got to sell those tough decisions to the public, and that's what he just didn't seem capable of doing.
I think the tragedy of Keir Starmer is that he comes in with this massive majority, slightly smaller than Blair's majority, but the sort of power that most leaders can only dream of. I mean, you look at Trump yesterday with Congress and all the other democracies in the EU, to have that level of power, he just didn't have the skills and the team in Downing Street that was able to deliver an agenda. I mean, I think you always need that broader narrative of change underpinning everything you do. And I think if you look over the next few weeks, he's going to try and explain what his legacy will be. And I would imagine that in terms of the two-child benefit cap, getting rid of it, he'll say, well, I've lifted 500,000 kids out of poverty. But even if you go back to that, he was forced into it. He didn't do it out of any enthusiasm. He did it because there was pressure on him by his own backbenchers. So he kind of did it in spite of his own instincts, and yet that will be one of his main policies that he's going to talk up.
I mean, I think he'll point to that. I think he'll point to the reforming workers' rights, but I mean, that still feels like it's kind of lost in the ether a bit at the moment. GB Energy, they took whatever happened to
Whatever that is.
to that one. Is, who knows?
GB what?
I think it's well, though. Obviously, Starmer's not a great politician. Clearly, he didn't really have much of a grasp on how to sell a vision, if he had one, to the country. But he made the comparison with Tony Blair. Tony Blair had this great team around him.
Mm-hmm.
Starmer had Rachel Reeves. I mean, such a weak, for a brand new government coming in with lots and lots of new MPs, such a weak top team. And I know we're going to move on to speak about Burnham. Burnham's going to have the same problem. But Ed Miliband, these guys, they can't hold a candle to the quality of ministers you had in the previous Tory government, and certainly not in the previous Labour/New Labour government.
So, as you say, Andy Burnham looks like being the only nominee to be the next Labour leader, and as things stand, he could be in Downing Street as Prime Minister by, I think, July the 18th. Mm-hmm. So we'll come on to what his agenda might look like, but do you think that he's a bit annoyed that he's only got 3.5 weeks to plan? I mean, if you work on the assumption that Keir Starmer messed up not having a positive agenda. He had so much time to develop that in opposition, didn't do it. How can someone put together such a plan within 3.5 weeks, putting together a team, advisors, an agenda?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult. Yeah, I think he was hoping to get, till September, maybe get Starmer to announce a timetable, possibly even into next year. I don't know. But I think he wanted a timetable. I don't think he wanted Starmer to stand up and say, look, forget it.
He's under pressure, isn't he? Because
under pressure
you
from the
have to
start.
make a good impression with voters early doors. Voters are so volatile these days, so impatient for change, that if you get it wrong, then by the time of the Labour conference in September, he might be facing calls for his resignation.
It could be. I mean, I think the main driver behind all this is ultimately the threat from reform, and Burnham showed by trouncing the opposition in the by-election. I think he's now seen, well, that's the answer. He can do the same nationwide. Now, whether he can, that remains to be seen. I think there was, obviously, he's a local lad who's very popular in Makerfield. I think it was, to say because he can win the Makerfield by-election, he can win a general election. They're two very different things.
So, John, Andy Burnham broadly is on the soft left of the Labour Party. In terms of an agenda, what we know, in terms of what he said, I think he wants greater public control of the utilities, things like water, energy, that sort of thing. He's a committed devolutionist, given that he was Greater Manchester Mayor. He's spoken about taking power away from Whitehall and Westminster and giving it to the nations and regions. There's a suggestion that he wants to relax borrowing rules in order to increase defence spending. I think he's got a book as well which says instinctively he always wants to spend more money. How would you imagine he will go about carving out his initial agenda?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting. We're talking about what is his master plan going to be, and how is he going to carry out? How is he going to quickly devise a new strategy for the country? And I guess we are assuming that there is going to be a radically different strategy for the country from the one that Keir Starmer was trying to enact. And I think it's far from clear at the moment that there is going to be a radical policy departure from broadly the things that Starmer was trying to do. I mean, if you think back to the previous times that Andy Burnham tried to become the leader of the Labour Party, the general perception was that perhaps he could be a bit of a political shapeshifter, that he would be what he needed to be at any given time. So it's far from clear what version of Andy Burnham we're going to get this time around. When I interviewed Andy a few years ago, he had been working a lot with Gordon Brown, and Gordon Brown's sort of vision for rewiring Britain. He talked a lot about essentially abolishing the House of Lords. It was about more metro mayors. It was about nationalisation. He was actually surprised. He's by no means a Scottish nationalist, but I think the quote at the time was, the constitutional question is clearly not settled, and he sort of alluded to the idea that a second referendum can't be off the table forever.
I think he'll drop that.
Well, exactly. That's my point. I think that the big question is, I mean, the ultimate ballsy move for Andy Burnham would be to come in and say, we're having a general election because I want a mandate for my new plan for Britain.
No,
I'm going
just
to
come up with
nationalise.
3.5
Yeah,
weeks.
I'm going to nationalise utilities, abolish the House of Lords.
Scrap the Barnett formula. That seems to be.
That's not going to happen
extra
either.
10 billion for defence, and maybe a referendum in Scotland to settle that question for good. That would be
I thought the last one settled it once and for all.
Yeah, well, this would be the ultimate radical
ultimate once and
agenda.
for all.
The
Until
other
the
end
next
of the
one.
spectrum is he comes in, he doesn't hold a general election because there's not really going to be a huge deviation from the manifesto that Labour are elected on at the moment, that he starts to listen to the people who are already in government, and what you're really going to see is the same broad policy platform and the hope that a different personality, a different face, a more astute political operator at the top can convince the public that it's a good thing to do.
Do you think there's the old sort of adage that they often say about football managers that Napoleon said that he wanted lucky generals.
Mm.
Do you think Burnham, a bit of that, as in, you said, Paul, Reeves and Starmer did the hard decisions, and everyone said at the time they're getting all the horrible bad news out of the way, and then they can reap the benefit in the 2 years before. But then,
unfortunately, the U-turned in quite a lot of them.
Yeah, true. So I don't know. Is Burnham going to enjoy the fruits of some of the money that was saved? But yeah, I suppose, like you said, they've actually U-turned on much.
I think the question of a general election is interesting. So he's kind of ruled it out, but still a bit of wiggle room there. And we're talking about, has he not got enough time to carve out his own agenda? The other way of looking at it is that he's in 3.5 weeks, and at roughly at the same time, the UK Parliament goes into recess. So he's not under any parliamentary scrutiny. So he could lay out a much more bold, radical Labour agenda, talking about, national bus fare caps and bringing various industries into public control, things that have got public opinion behind them. Whether or not they're good ideas, I don't know, but popular things and immediate cost of living measures. He then has a bounce in the polls, maybe goes up 6 or 7 points in the run-up to his party conference. He might just think, it's not going to get as good as this. This is probably the summit for me.
Well,
and then he goes to the country on that agenda.
If he was part of Brown's team, Gordon Brown famously ducked the challenge, and it backfired.
So I think the Brown comparison is very good, because Brown got in, I think, in 2007, and then he made some good decisions early doors, and his poll rating went up, and a lot of folk around him felt, well, now's a good time to go for it, because when they actually get to know Gordon Brown, they're not going to like him. And that's what happened in the end. He lost 3 years later.
Was Andy Burnham part of that team, do you think?
He was a minister, I think he was a cabinet minister under Gordon Brown.
He was one of those who said, go for it. I
think Douglas Alexander was one of those who said, go for it. I'm not sure if Burnham was in that coterie of people. But there is a feeling like the dynamic has changed. I mean, it was Nigel Farage versus Keir Starmer, the UK's most unpopular politician. Now Farage is up against this semi-lefty northerner who is quite popular. I mean, that might change, but if I was Farage, I'd be more worried.
I think so. I think as well. Now, how much Burnham had to do with this, I don't know. But you say he's sort of soft left. I think he's also aware of the culture wars in the UK, and the Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable, I think, is interesting, because he's come in and he's said, look, we're having, he's the anti-woke. He's going to be tough on crime. He's not sort of taking any what get termed woke policies. So I think Burnham is aware that he's got to appeal to that section, a very, very large section of the population who look at Keir Starmer and Labour and sort of Starmer taking the knee and all this, and that's why he's so unpopular. It's not that he's his policies failed. It's that he's seen as the sort of the ultimate figurehead for the sort of liberal left that many people think have really sort of taken over and almost ruined the country. So I think Burnham's alive to that as well.
I think it's essential that when he gets in, his immediate priority is the core economic issues facing people across the UK. Regardless of what you think about so-called culture wars or woke issues, it's about money in people's pockets. And if he addresses that in his first 100 days, I think you'll see his popularity increase.
Well, I think his best chance of success is that he comes in and benefits from a sort of economic bounce for the UK, which there is signs that may well be happening. Won't have anything to do with Andy Burnham, but
with the tariffs, I think, being a thing of the past, and then maybe a deal with Iran to stop the war, you might actually see sort of the global shoots of recovery.
Yeah, I think events out with our control tend to often define Prime Minister's success, and Andy Burnham will be hoping against hope that he kind of benefits from
Well, this is the
a
point about,
changing
is
global
he
picture.
lucky? The other thing is Trump could lose the midterms, and suddenly he's like this lame duck president for the last 2 years. Trump's a much diminished force in the world. The signs are good for him.
I think he does need to come up with a couple of eye-catching policies that are distinctively Andy Burnham's ideas, and it is quite difficult to think what they would be. Like, does he look at something like a wealth tax or whatever? You know, people will be looking for something that shows that he is this leader of the soft left, rather than...
I mean, if the Tories can freeze energy bills, why can't a Labour government? I mean, the energy bills keep going up and up. We were promised a cut. Can't you do something on that? I know it's hugely expensive, but maybe you could change the borrowing rules. And
I mean, his big thing seems to be that he would like to nationalise utilities, which, you know, could well be a good thing for Britain, but it does feel like that would be a decades-long mission that is not going to have a palpable effect on people's lives for a long, long time.
I wouldn't be surprised to see him borrow. I mean, who came up with the ideas first? You wonder, but some of the SNP policies, like you say, cap bus fares.
I think Starmer did first, actually.
Which Starmer had done first. I mean, Andy Burnham loves a bus. You go down to Manchester, there's these B buses everywhere you turn. But also maybe some sort of supermarket food cap, which again was actually a Tory idea first.
I mean, obviously, the main issue above all other issues is what does it mean for Scotland? So
Absolutely.
I can't imagine he's going to go down the route of Indiref 2.
No, I don't.
The Barnett formula is here to stay. But speaking to some of the Scottish Labour MPs when I was in Westminster last week, they are heartened that he is someone who understands devolution, that he's not a Whitehall man, that he might be sympathetic to more powers for the Scottish Parliament or councils. He's someone, he's not a Starmer type figure, someone who tolerates devolution, probably hasn't given it much thought. He's actually lived and breathed it.
Certainly he's a northerner. If you go back a couple of years, his entire thing was the idea of pushing more power out of Whitehall and into the nations and regions. Now, that's not to say, I don't think he was really a fan of giving more power to the Scottish Parliament. He would prefer to give more than the Scottish Government. He would prefer to give, perhaps create
a Glasgow mayor,
Glasgow mayor, an Edinburgh mayor, a Highland mayor. Is ideas like that he seemed to be very up for. And I guess the other really interesting question is, will Andy Burnham's assent have an impact on who the leadership of Scottish Labour is going to be long term? There has been a lot of speculation that perhaps Anas Sarwar won't stay in the job for that much longer, despite the fact he's not, he's given no public indication that he's going to quit soon, but there is that feeling. And if Anas at some point was going to decide to call it a day, then does an Andy Burnham in Downing Street mean that perhaps you might get a more left-leaning candidate as Labour leader in Scotland?
My reading of it is that Anas Sarwar has been waiting for the resolution of this UK leadership drama.
Yeah.
And now that Burnham is going to be the Prime Minister, obviously he's got a good relationship with the Mayor of Greater Manchester. All sorts of options open up. I mean, I don't know if Anas Sarwar sees himself as being in the House of Lords, but you could imagine him maybe going to the Lords and then ending up as a minister in a Burnham government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or he could be the first mayor of Greater Glasgow.
Yeah, I think the issue with the mayors in Scotland is you would need the cooperation of the Scottish Parliament, and I think the SNP has been very clear that they don't support that. So yeah, I think if you look, Scottish Labour have got an internal review of their election defeat. I think that the relationship with the UK party is part of that review. It's supposed to be published or submitted, I think, early September. You can just see the sort of outlines of the timing of Anas Sarwar's departure. Burnham in, the review done, maybe changing the relationship with the UK party. And then who knows, Lord Sarwar of Lossiemouth, I think that's where his family's originally from.
Lossiemouth?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Glasgow.
I think that Andy Burnham, the first 100 days or so are going to be absolutely crucial for him. There's going to be a lot of very difficult questions, all these things that he's been talking about previously that I think we all know he's going to have to dump. How's he going to explain this stuff? He's previously been a big fan of, for example, complete voting reform and proportional representation.
He might cling to that.
Is some of this stuff going to survive?
He's also got the Manchester mayor by-election, which, I mean, that could be
He might just a Burnham premiership, a boost in the polls might be enough to get that election over the line.
That would be a big reform win. That would be a horrible start to his new premiership.
Okay, moving on. So Peter Murrell, the story that never dies. He was sentenced to 5 years and 3 months earlier this week in relation to embezzling over 400 grand of SNP funds. John, a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, we were saying that we know what he did, how he did it, but we're still in the dark about why he did it. Now, following the sentencing hearing this week, I'm still none the wiser as to what the answer is to that question. His KC basically said at this hearing that he's embarrassed, that he feels deep shame, that he's been ostracised. He put his hands up for what he did, didn't sort of quibble about, he didn't try and blame anyone else, but there was no real sense of this is why he did it.
Yeah,
there was no reference to mental health or having a problem with stealing. He just seemed to ask for mercy from the judge.
We didn't really get a sort of mitigating plea. I mean, it's just a theory, but my working theory would be, I think, if you read about fraud and the most common causes of fraud, it's where people feel they're entitled to something that they're not getting. My theory would be that Peter Murrell felt like he had played a leading role in creating the modern SNP, and that he saw his sort of other colleagues going into ministerial jobs, six-figure salaries, because he was married to the First Minister. He couldn't get that on the books, and he felt like he was entitled to top up his salary in other ways that turned out to be entirely illegal. And
it's a heck of a top up.
But it also,
I mean, you might well be right.
But also,
what a sad demise.
But also, if you look at the figures, they kind of.
Was he not on 110 grand though?
Well, so it was 110. Then when Nicola Sturgeon became First Minister, his salary dropped in the accounts to about 70, and then it disappears out of the accounts altogether. It's actually an interesting question: is how much was he getting paid during the period that his salary wasn't listed in the accounts? But if you assume that it was around £70,000 or something like that, he embezzled 400,000 over 10 years. £40,000 a year, probably take him to what he was on previously. What he thought he was due, and what he was seeing as other colleagues like Alex Salmond and John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon getting their ministerial jobs. That would be my.
Couldn't he have just asked his wife for a pay rise?
Well, I think that's the problem, that they felt it would look bad if she gave him one. That,
better than like half inch and 400 grand.
If Nicola Sturgeon was making 140 as First Minister and he was getting another 140 as SNP CEO, it looks like you're kind of cashing in the cause.
What do you think? Why did he do it?
That's as good an explanation as any I've heard. The judge did say something about his personal circumstances. I think that was the words he used, but then he didn't go into it anymore. He just said, due to his personal circumstances. What does that mean? So no, I just think it's just greed. That's the only explanation I can come up with. I think he. Like John says, he saw people enjoying very luxurious lifestyles. He's thinking we're both doing these incredibly high-powered jobs, working long hours. Why shouldn't I have a £2.5 grand salt and pepper set or a Jaguar I-Pace. I mean, the motivation, Peter Murrell maybe one day will explain. I still think that there's so many unanswered questions around all this that the sentencing, ordinarily you'd say the sentencing is kind of the end of the story for any crime-related tale.
It's not going to be the end of this
It's not going to
story.
be the end of this. This is almost just the beginning. You know, we've got the legal
Yeah,
stuff out
this
of
is
the
the
way.
first chapter out of the way.
Yeah.
Now we've got the
Now,
remaining 9 or 10
yeah,
chapters.
now
to
we need
start.
to find out
SNP's
why
political
this happened.
enemies see this as the thing that they can potentially destroy the SNP's stranglehold over Scottish politics with, and so they're not going to let it go for a long time.
No.
Peter Murrell doesn't strike me as the sort of man who was made for prison.
Well, we had a story, and the prison service never say where prisoners are serving their sentence. What we're told, the rumour is that he's in HMP Dumfries, which is seen as probably the cushiest prison in Scotland. There are no Category C prisons, but that's seen as probably the easiest one to do your time. There's a lot of quite elderly prisoners in there. Many of these guys who've been convicted of historic sex offences are in there, and you know, they're quite elderly. It's not a place with a lot of gangsters or, you know, Glasgow Huns out to make a name for themselves by doing in Peter Murrell in the canteen. So it's not the worst. I mean, no one wants to spend any time in prison. It's not the worst place. It's got a garden. It's got this huge 5-acre garden.
Could be a few former MSPs in there, Dr. Law. You could share a cell with Jordan Linden. Or...
Well, he could, yeah. I wonder if it does seem to be the place where, so yeah, Linden might end up down
It's got
there.
a garden, yeah.
It's got a garden, yeah.
You can take that electric mower in there.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. This is the point we did a story on this, and he's quite green-fingered. So yeah, I'm sure he'll be put to good use in the HMP Dumfries prison garden.
What do you think? 5 years, 3 months? He's probably out after 2.5.
Yeah, I think that suggests perhaps even less on a tag. I mean, it would be an interesting question just how long he spends in prison. One of the things that the SNP have been doing over the last couple of years is to try to get as many people out of prison as
can you imagine
possible.
how terrible it would be if Angela Constance stands up in the Scottish Parliament, announces another tranche of early releases, and Murrell was part of it?
Yeah, for prisoners serving less than 6 years this time.
And he gets picked up at the gates in a camper van.
See, this is the thing, though. The sentence crosses the threshold from short term to long term. So he won't be part of any of the early releases. So anyone serving 4 years or more is classed as a long-term prisoner. So he is up there with serious criminals.
Yeah, it's interesting that they went for more than 5 years, because you're right, it takes you into almost a different category of
I think it's a different release point
tariff,
as well.
and I would imagine that behind the scenes, and maybe this has something to do with the length of time that the case took to be resolved, that his lawyers would have been desperately trying to agree some kind of deal that would have taken him down into
They didn't have a strong hand, though, did they?
No, they didn't have much to play with.
I mean, they didn't manage to get much kicked off the indictment, like 40, 50,000.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things. Why didn't he say, you know, I had a shopping addiction, the stress, you know, I hate to use the phrase, the mental health card, but, you know, that is, I'm sure his lawyers said, look, Peter, if there's a reason, if there's a sort of psychological reason why you think this maybe happened, you need to say this in court. He's obviously decided not to.
If you look at the nature of the spending, it does point to perhaps not a particularly happy person who's developed a weird fascination with salt and pepper shakers and
multiple
the like.
£3,000 coffee machines.
Yeah, there is something almost quite sad about the nature of the things that he was buying.
But, you know, he hasn't used that as a defence. He hasn't said, look, I was under immense pressure, but the relationship was, as we now know, that they've been separated for some time. He could have said, look, the relationship was breaking down, and I just used this as a release valve. I do think he might have got a bit more time knocked off.
One subplot for me is that John Swinney was in the Parliament yesterday he did a huddle with the press outside the so-called media pen. Won't talk about that. And he, to his credit, he answered a lot of questions about the Murrell scandal, and he repeated the apology that he made after Peter Murrell pled guilty, and that was effectively saying, I'm sorry to SNP members for what happened, that they lost money from this. It wasn't taking responsibility for what Murrell did. Obviously, Murrell's crimes are a matter for Peter Murrell, but he did say sorry to SNP members. Nicola Sturgeon still hasn't done that,
No,
even though she was SNP leader at the time.
Yeah, for me, that's where I can't really understand John Swinney's position in not putting a bit of distance between him and Nicola Sturgeon. He obviously feels emotionally very much connected with her. He doesn't want to let her down, but how can you possibly defend the fact that she's not apologised for any of this? And it would appear many of these items, she may still have them. There's been calls from others in the SNP that things should be returned and sold so that the party can recoup some of the money. I don't think John Swinney's been particularly forthcoming in any plans to do that. So yeah, it feels like we've had the apology from First Minister, but it's not really been backed up by much more. And I think the idea that he is the victim as well, that the party is the victim of this crime, it doesn't really stack up, does it? It seems clear that the SNP, nothing was really ring-fenced in the accounts, that money went in and money was spent on stuff.
Yeah,
and there was a lot of that money was public money, short money, etc. And that has been part of a big pot, much of which was embezzled by Peter Murrell. So it's not just the SNP that are the victims here, it's everyone. And I think that we could do with getting a wee bit more from John Swinney. I think he would be well advised to
go a bit further.
Because the likelihood is that he's going to find himself being pushed there.
Because this crime was taking place. Obviously, the money was being stolen from the SNP, but Peter Murrell and Nicola Sturgeon were essentially running the devolved government during this time. Peter Murrell was running the party that ran the government. Nicola Sturgeon was actually running the government. So the backdrop to it is of huge public interest. And the idea that there shouldn't be an inquiry is for the birds, I think.
There was a really interesting bit in the judges summing up yesterday. So to paraphrase what the SNP's official response has been, it's almost like Peter Murrell's been this criminal mastermind who has subverted the internal controls of the SNP to line his own pockets. But the judge said that his fraud was not particularly sophisticated. So basically, the financial controls were so weak he was able to do this, such as being able to sign off his own expenses. And I'm sorry, but the financial controls of a political party are ultimately on the leader.
I mean, it doesn't seem like there was really any controls at all.
No.
The truth is, it was the least sophisticated fraud ever. He spent a bunch of money and not let anyone look at the bank account. That's what has happened.
And then spent some more.
It would appear for 10 years that was accepted.
And no one is checking the codes that he's listing for items of spending with the receipts. That's preposterous.
And then saying, I'll tell you what, I'll loan you some back of the money that I've stolen.
And I think that is one of the key things. It's impossible to understand at that point why Nicola Sturgeon wouldn't have been questioning her husband, who was apparently earning about £70,000, deciding to give the SNP a loan of over £100,000. I mean, it doesn't really stack up, does it?
No. All right, I think we've run out of time. Thanks very much to John and to Ben for joining me, and thanks also to Henrik from the Daily Record video team. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Record's YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.